Hello everyone, today we talk about universities and new fields of knowledge in the Low Middle Ages. We have already dealt with these topics in the past: medieval university, education, even art. Today we will cover even more broadly altogether these topics. And I can also tell you that we are right substantially also at the end of some of the manualistic topics that we started to address 2 years ago, so this will allow us eventually to descend gradually into some more detailed and specific topics. But it's important every once in a while just to revive this broader look at, in fact, a general picture that requires synthesis in a way. And as you know, Schwerpunkt cares a lot about this rather than just the hyper-specialization, because if you lack the general perspective, you can hyper-specialize, but you'll have difficulties eventually to address the whole issue in its specific context. So today we talk essentially about, we start from the 12th century, right? That represented, as we have seen many times, this period dense of novelties, also from, greatly, I would say, from the cultural point of view. People increased, right? Europe was growing, and together with them, the complexity of their organization, Europe was becoming more literate, and there is also the literary level, the spread of vernacular languages as consequences, and also a more general revival of lay culture, right? So this introduced in many ways innovations in the methods, in the contents, and in the organization of scholastic knowledge, right? And crucial for the evolution of the attitude towards the ancients of the Latin and patristic tradition, towards the authority of Rome. People began to look at, in kind of a different way. We've seen it especially in the videos about the Goliards, that of course were kind of the extreme in that range, but that is properly, in fact, I remember the title was the one, the Goliards and the expansion of medieval thought, right? So that went in parallel and unavoidably, right? Wherever culture expands, with this also kind of sarcastic and, in fact, satirical attitude, but together with that, actually a great deal of evolution and the concept that naturally things could be seen from different perspectives, but that this didn't cause moral relativism. On the contrary, this gave birth to a universalist thought, a grandiose, scientifical, philosophical, and a spiritual take on the world that is reflected by scholastics, and that emerges from a crisis, right? This is particularly important. Knowledge, official authorities were challenged in many ways, and the problem is that there wasn't a counter intellectual system to oppose to that, right? So what is managed what is achieved actually successfully, but in a moment that could really took other turns by the hierarchies, by the authorities, was to be able to actually update, right, and to even integrate part of the new knowledge that was coming in Europe by making this rational, structured, systematic building that was used to organize, discipline, and administer society in an evolved way, in a civil way. And in this regard, we owe way more than we usually think to the Middle Ages, and especially this central, central medieval time that, in a way, is how we have mostly embodied the Middle Ages, at least in the majority of Western countries, properly the 13th century. This moment of universalism, of scholastics, right? The triumph of the feudal monarchies, of Aristotelianism over can say over Platonism, because Platonism was always from at the side of this building, but at the same time, a reasonable approach being more prevalent than a Platonic one. It was also developing, by the way. We've seen it with Bernard of Clairvaux, with this, even artistical take on beauty, on humanistic standards, and so on. But there is an very important scientific orientation embodied by Aristotelianism that actually prevails and will remain at the base of the Western scientific system for a long time to come, right? And in fact, the intellectual curiosities were triggered in many ways by the revival, the recovery of texts of Hellenic authors such as Plato, in fact, Aristotle, or Euclid, that were at this point forgotten or barely known in Western Europe, right? So there was this fervor of translation from Hellenic, from Hebrew, from Arab, that all cultures that were at this point widely collected, all the great Romano-Hellenistic works and treasured them more than what had happened in the West. This should be this is true, of course, but we shouldn't underestimate, even in this sense, the fact that the West was recovering these texts exactly because their elites were starting to look at what the West had been able to preserve, and it surely had built its own knowledge, a system of the world on the ancient authorities, and was now actively searching for them. These translations, we made several videos actually about especially the translations from Hellenic and Arab and so on. So from one side there is objectively, even from those cultures, and in a much broader, even geographical picture than simply the Near East or the Byzantine Empire, of this enormous enrichment, cultural enrichment of the same Platonian or Aristotelian works, right? That had been translated, in fact, in those languages that now were translated to Latin in Western Europe, but that had been commented and enriched also with other notions that came sometimes from other systems, like, I don't know, the Indian one, or, that had integrated other, simply other cultural elements that were proper, for example, late antiquity, right? Until the late Middle Ages, for example, nobody knew precisely in West the difference between Plato and Plotinus, for example. They thought that the works were the same part of Plato, actually, and therefore there was a great work around, definitely a view of the past that gradually came, especially with humanism, to get more philologically refined, but nevertheless was triggered mainly by this enormous thirst of knowledge that the medieval men, I think, for which medieval men tops any other culture, historically speaking, right? There's never been such an enormous and inexhausted thirst of knowledge like in the Middle Ages. The Enlightenment cannot compare by the slightest, because during the Enlightenment there was mostly an encyclopedical need, right? To find the criteria through which certain knowledge could be classified. In the Middle Ages, that structure did not exist, so these people had to find on their own, right, the frames in which to set, and this required a much greater conceptual effort that is in fact embodied by scholastics. And the medium for the circulation of the Hellenic thought, because that's what at the end of the day was most of these texts were, was especially Muslim Spain, right, especially Toledo, right, that was eventually reconquered by the Christians and kept maintaining this role of major center of translations. And here we find literally French men, northern Italians that literally come from their home to Spain specifically to search for those works, to translate them in there, to come back, and therefore enriching also in a at a scale of that we can't start to define properly as European, right? Even if they, we're still far from the idea of Europe we have now, that is essentially a modern one, but yeah, that were naturally part of this broader intellectual, with this broader education that was fundamentally about, first of all, based on a universal language that was Latin. Of course, it was the official language of the empire, of the church. And these languages that were fundamentally, of course, Latin, Germanic, most of the cases, but also presenting, for example, Celtic influence or the same Arab ones that injected the part of even of elements that these areas in the Mediterranean had always exchanged. After all, had much more in common than we usually think, and that goes in parallel with lots of other traffics that are of huge, unprecedented scale, actually, especially we're talking about the great Mediterranean trade, right? I don't know how we can still today have this gloomy, dark, flat picture of the Middle Ages as, a place where, nobody traveled, nobody knew anything about the rest. It just takes to study these things and see how much and how far these people traveled, right? Surely these weren't average people, but they weren't just like, the elites, the ultra elite. There were somewhat also middle class, right? So, and actually the greatest intellectual ferment began from that. And the interesting aspect of this is also that there is probably a feudal and a communal civilization here that go in parallel, right? So there are major centers of study that are embodied fundamentally by the Kingdom of France, that is mostly, theological and also, in this sense, ideologically oriented, right? That is reflected by the great Capetian hierarchy, feudalism as a defined social structure, and central northern Italy with a communal civilization, practically oriented, also more scientifically oriented, that pioneered both of them, most of the technological, the cultural, the intellectual achievements of this time. And all the rest of Europe was coming together with that. England, Germany, mostly. Spain, of course, it was in the middle. Spain was a bit of a universe on its own, and it has extremely fascinating characteristics that develop, that seem to point at, even a greater development in certain cases. We have seen it, for example, in the video just in military history about the Spanish Knight of the 12th, 13th centuries, these centuries in here, how, we find in Spain and in the Iberian Peninsula, actually, the certain even technological the innovations or improvements in arms and armor that you don't find even in what usually France and Italy are conceived to be the most updated areas. Well, here seemingly that frontier, surely the Reconquista wasn't a child's play, probably contributed to boost this dramatic development. The proof that the Westerners actively went, right, sometimes not just in Spain, even in North Africa, in the Near East. Think about the great trade centers in here, the main that connected to the major intercontinental routes that are they're growing fast. Here is demonstrated so that the West didn't receive this stuff passively, but simply went for getting it. Is demonstrated by the various commentators that enriched the classical scientific tradition. Right, this is never to be conceived like these guys found this book and humanism spread. No, most of the cultural accomplishments in this regard, not just in medieval Europe, but a bit more in the rest of the world, are always triggered by a pre-existing substratum that was at least at the same level at that point of the stuff that they were absorbing, right? Because it doesn't work otherwise, right? You can't expose primitive civilization to knowledge and thinking that this thing will magically make it rise to the same. If there is no pre-existing capabilities, you don't make it. And surely Western Europe, and we have seen it many times at that point, was dramatically advanced, right? At this point, by the 12th century, if Latin Germanic structures could be considered backwards up to that point in early medieval times, say to the Byzantines, to the Arabs, at this point they reach the same level. Also, the trade balance goes the other way around. Europe starts getting much more gold. They have much more production. They have this demographic booming. It's simply an astonishing development, right? So they start taking the upper hand. All these comments were developing an enormous systems. This is best exemplified actually by the Gloxerist tradition of the Bolognese school that we talk about for our medieval law videos, but that we will touch here in a while as well. So that they weren't just mere comments; they were entire works on their own. right? The comment was the first comment, and the second comment, then the third guy that arrived and made a criticism of the two and created its own, that others arrived, added the other things. So it became sometimes, entire books on their own that were valued, right, as a for the gloss to the original text. That definitely shows an extremely sophisticated exegesis of these ancient works, and that speak for the great level actually of literacy, especially in certain areas of Europe at this time, that were capable of easily criticizing these works and not getting them passively, because they weren't getting them passively on their own, right? The reverence towards the authority is something that is revived ideologically, conceptually, mostly in the Renaissance, right, during humanism. The idea that, after all, the ancient world was perfection, and now, the humanists were coming out of the darkness of the Middle Ages. That's where all those prejudices began. But what the medievals actually did a couple of centuries before was getting the stuff and having no complex of inferiority towards them. Right, they were completely able to say, okay, I don't need this because, it was just an authority, right? Of course, I appreciate and revere the authority, but I also don't think that the authority is, should substitute the things that I have created on my own, and they actually use, in fact, just to complement, to fill those gaps that, in my own system now remain uncovered, right? And this is brilliantly explained, I would say, by the recovery of the Roman law. I've made a lot of videos about this. We find comments about Averroes, 1126, 1198, the philosophical works of Aristotle, Maimonides, 1135, 1204. So we see actually also in the Islamic and Jewish world similar accomplishments, right? The idea that there was a broader universalist ambition of these cultures to frame the world, right, scientifically in a reliable way. Very important commentaries were written about the medical work of Hippocrates and Galenus, famously enough. But here we come properly to the center of knowledge, a new center of knowledge, something in its own kind of revolutionary. I don't like to use the term revolutionary, but it was objectively one of those phenomena that just for the spread of it and the achievements on their own really changed the history of the world in this area of Europe, because universities as centers of knowledge weren't just framed under official authorities, properly were rising from the bottom of society, from middle classes, right? Prove the absolute necessity of getting educated was understood already by these people, right? And at very high levels, right? These weren't learning how to write, right? These people already knew how to do it. There were certain areas of Europe, the levels of literacy were extremely high, for actually the highest medieval standards, even in the countryside sometimes. And it's exactly the same areas where universities start to rise, right? Also, a little digression, when we look at Middle Ages, always consider that, depending on where you come from, usually speaking, you have a picture of what the average reality was, right? Things like per capita wealth, education, even political status, etc. It's not equal all over Europe. There isn't an homogeneous, take. You say, that there is just one Middle Ages, one medieval society, and this is generally kind of dark and unproductive, and people are illiterate and so on. No, certain centers are dramatically developed, and more than else, the entire Europe is interconnected in this sense, right? There is the beauty of this period is truly the universalistic effort. We have seen also the universalistic ambitions. We have seen also how this had come to happen just from an educational point of view. The so-called Carolingian Renaissance, properly from an educational point of view, was actually an enormously successful thing. It's actually probably the only success of the Carolingian Empire given its collapse, but it was nevertheless one of the most important in European history. Like without the Carolingian educational reforms, without the Carolingian Church, we wouldn't have had a properly European common culture and identity, right? knowing how to write in Latin, knowing essentially the same texts, obviously framed now by that time fully on Christian religion, the same structures of education, the monasteries, right? The way of literally of the same ways of writing, producing books, right? Not just the Carolingian type writing, but properly the way of conceiving the book as a vehicle of knowledge, right? This interconnection existed since at least the 8th century in Europe, and it was deeply homogenized by that time, so much that the apex of universalism of scholastic is the same Gothic writing, and the simply that reflected to a broader catalogation, framing of knowledge in a specific structure, right, that had to make up properly the order of a universal system. So the universities, the term comes from the Latin word universitas, which designated generally a community in a juridical sense, right? Lots of communities were called like this in the Middle Ages, and with this name were indicated both the urban and rural communities, right? The term seemingly started to spread from southern Italy, and it eventually came to encompass broader guilds and corporations, right? And all the various associations, eventually also of masters and students, that gave life in some cities to this higher secondary teaching. And the set of courses from a didactical point of view was instead called studium proper. Hence, also the not the interchangeability of the term, but also the synonym in this regard, because the coming together of all this new knowledge and the growing request of education of, as we've seen, of advanced character, brought to the creation of new places properly, of the creation of knowledge, the studia, so the studies, as the universities were designated, and that had, and this is also very important, in the urban seats, their origins, right, and also in different ways, right? This wasn't a completely homogeneous, like every university had its own history in many ways. The first studium, famously enough, was the one of Bologna, established at the end of the 11th century by initiative of associations of students interested in receiving lessons of law by qualified lay masters, right? While in Paris, from the end of the 12th century, by the will of the clergymen, professors of theology at the Episcopal school, in order to subtract themselves from the control of the bishop, right? In Oxford, the studies were imported after the transfer in 1167 of students from and masters and teachers from Paris, right? In the same way, a university was born in Padua in 1222 because of a diaspora of students and of teachers from the Bolognese studium. In Naples in 1224, it was Frederick II of Hohenstaufen to found the university to educate the functionaries to employ in the Kingdom of Sicily, that was aiming at that point at a centralized central administration, and to recognize in 1231 as studium also the very ancient medical school of Salerno that was probably not a university, but had an enormous practical and theoretical tradition alike. In Toulouse, in southern France, it was instead the Pope to begin university in 1229 in order to contrast the Cathar influence in the region. So you understand how many different realities in here. We go from city-states to kingdoms to the papacy. We go from the layman that really need someone to teach them something more evolved about law, or clergymen that simply want to explore theology without the control of the bishop, this will cause problems, by the way, especially from a theological point of view. We see here even the attempt to repress Catholicism, that in many ways was connected to certain heresies that you will find also in the Parisian school. We made several videos about these incidents. If you go in the medieval Christianity playlist, you'll find plenty of this. And for this reason, universities didn't entertain always easy relations with the local city authorities, right? And they searched instead for recognitions and privileges from sovereigns and popes, because also in here the universities were actually a big system, right? They were people that surely brought a lot of wealth to the city just for thinking about the rents or the eating and drinking and all this stuff. But at the same time, this there were entire factions. Also, very peculiar character in here is the international character of these communities. Like, there were students from all over Europe, and they distinguished themselves into various national groups, let's say, that could even be opposed to each other, and there were riots and difficulties even for local communities to maintain their own order. And naturally, kings and popes, who were quite interested in increasing their own political grasp on the various communities, began to say, okay, I give the privilege through my own authority to these universities to exist, and the local city can't do anything about that, right? It's a pretty messed up for the city in some ways. In other ways, the cities were able to expel certain elements, at least of this university, that created, as we've seen, also universities in other cities. So it's actually very complex, but at a certain time it's very logical, and it fits perfectly well with this broader need for hires. And naturally, the city is the center of trade. This studies organization varied university from university. However, in line of principle, the first cycle was provided by the Faculty of the Arts, right? The famous trivium and quadrivium. That the branches of the liberal arts are indicated in the Middle Ages with within this term, that is basically free arts, that are in this sense devoid of any venial interest, right? It's just people that want to properly learn, right? And for being an accomplished human being with an independent intellect. Differently, for example, from the mechanical ones, right? That is the manuals and practical that, in this sense are not negatively conceived at all, because actually in medieval civilizations, like in any others, these two were deeply intertwined, but that were tied more evidently to a specific profession, tied mostly to trade, to handcraft, to artisanal activities. They were oriented also to that end. And after the 10th century, when in the 9th century actually, when they became properly the base of scholastic teaching, the liberal arts were distinguished into groups. The ones of trivium, as we have seen, that is to say, the sciences of language, grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, and those of the quadrivium, that is, the arts of nature proper. So arithmetics, geometry, astronomy, and music. And with the development of universities, these disciplines constituted the preparation course, right, in the Faculty of the Arts, in order to deal eventually with the most difficult subjects, theology, medicine, and law, that were, the top of medieval science in many ways. Theologians, doctors, and lawyers were revered in those societies. They achieved certain levels, even of knighthood, for example, because they simply made societies earn also in their own regard a lot, right? People needed these individuals, the society needed them to organize themselves, to work effectively, to solve matters. These people were authorities in their own kind, right? And it's interesting how this jobs, we could say, like doctors and lawyers, but albeit being very different in line of principle to the ones that are today, but however how they were considered, like, today with the spread of education, mass cultures, etc. Doctors and lawyers are, kind of like other jobs, right? They're considered rightfully better paid, and more somewhat, there's the idea of more greater success attached to them, but they're still somewhat they're very leveled compared to the past. And in that world, these people were, held in an enormous consideration, and they for the well-being of the entire society. This is also fascinating. It's something that, also from a moral and the ontological point of view, differs a lot from our own times. Naturally, education was very different. Like doctors, for example, at the time didn't touch patients, for example. Lawyers were also something, more than naturally, they're more closer to today's figures of judges, of higher magistracies that co-work with the state and so on. So there is naturally but there was also the time of segmentation in this regard, and there was a spread, for example, notariate, especially in certain areas, that was enormous, just demographically speaking. So among the population, there were lots of notaries, and people simply were skilled in this because it reflects the enormous economical activities that needed to be disciplined legally, the various contracts, the various agreements, and so on, that these people were required to certify in a world where, this is important, where central authorities didn't quite work, right? In gradually, like the 13th century is the greater moment, allegedly, of universal powers, but as a matter of fact, this is also, the beginning of the crisis. By the 14th century, the papacy and the empire start controlling ever less. And there is actually a great reconsideration of what the various prerogatives were. So these figures began to rise also in a institutional sense, in a political sense, in ways that had to create probably a new balance and original synthesis of what societies had to work like. So this is in fact even I can say a controversial topic, but we have to think that we don't have to idealize this system, but also we don't have to banalize it for what it concretely was, because probably the Middle Ages were devoid of a centralized state in the one we live, and that we know, with extremely rigid structures and overwhelmingly powerful authority. At the time, communities had to organize their own system, and the Ancien Regime simply worked like this, right? It was based on the local prerogatives that had to be, where the public ones had just to preserve and to shelter in a way. But of course, a long time there was also the process of gradually, eroding this for the sake of governability. And this is a controversial thing, of course. Civilization increases the more, such prerogatives are, reduced, but that's all another chapter about, social contract and so on. But the Faculty of Liberal Arts, this first cycle lasted 6 years. And it was accessed usually at the year of 13, right? This is like a middle high school fundamentally, and the consequent title of bachelor gave access to the major faculties of civil law, of canon law, or medicine, or theology, as we've seen. But these were almost never concentrated in the same city, right? At the end of the studies was, granted the title of doctor, that allowed to teach everywhere, right? Consider this detail, that there was, this title was recognized, we could say, not worldwide, because it would be excessive, but, within the Western system, fundamentally, it was accepted as such, and naturally, even in other, in other areas, these scholars were appreciated, right? And there was an interchange in this regard also with with other centers. Think about in later times, it would be particularly influenced with humanism. Think about all the Byzantine scholars that came to the West after the fall of Constantinople. I mean, there was a shared, a tacit agreement, a tacit, recognition of the value of a learned man. Also because, of course, there were less, but also probably because the ways in which these people were educated were very peculiar, right? So they could be, can say, were standardized, but they surely were renowned as having passed through a specific degree of examination and of tradition. And these studies were actually pretty harsh, right? We'll see it better actually in our medieval law studies, but these people had to learn an astonishing amount of stuff by heart, right? Nothing to do with modern universities. We do it's just a chat, and learning a meta structure, but nothing to do with the intellectual commitment, just intellective one, right? It was a devastating thing for our own standards, but also at the time considered that there were people who knew, the Bible by heart, for example, that the memory was much more trained in many ways. Books costed, so people, very often had it cheaper to memorize them rather than buying them, right? So it was a completely different system in many ways that also reflects how dramatically lazy, mentally speaking, we have become, and especially for what the qualitative process is involved in concretely, and how much just with a different system we could easily learn, right? We are the same identical people biologically speaking, right? And this could be done easily even today if it just was a political social consensus about it. So education naturally was in Latin, and it consisted in the reading, the lectio, and in the comment, the question, of a fundamental text from the side of the master that evidenced the interpretative problems that were eventually discussed with the students during the disputatio, so it was called. And this method of teaching and of research is usually named as scholastic. In fact, the term that derives naturally from the Latin schola, right, that in origin meant disquisition, and eventually for translation applied center of teaching, actually wasn't used in the sources at the time, right? It was used eventually for a long time in order to address the specific philosophical, theological, and scientific thinking elaborated in this, usually monastic, cathedral, and university schools, even since the, historiographically speaking, since the 6th century usually to the 14th, right, where there is probably the crisis of the universalism, in order to designate this, as we've seen, this educational system and culture that spread from it, being born around the project of reconciling the religious revelation and the scientific, the scientific spectrum, the liberal and mechanic arts, for example, and medicine and law, and so on. So today, the term scholasticism prevails in the studies as a notion, usually as a more limited notion of scholasticism, referred to the method of teaching developed in the universities between the 13th and 14th century, and it's centered on the approach to the text founded on the triad of lectio, quaestio, and disputatio, right? But the concept is broader historiographically, but at the same time, it didn't exist as such at the time. So it can mean different things dependently on which parameters you're taking into consideration. So this method, however, produced enormous compendia known as summe, in order to order proper the disciplinary knowledge and the comments of teachers in forms of notes at the margin of the texts, the famous glosse, that gave life, as we have seen before, to a system, actually to a very efficient system of production of copies of manuscripts that were fundamentally recognized as authoritative by officially by every studium, right? So that there was even a very interesting copying system known as the pecha that served to the various students to get this or that part of the book, and these were officialized bookshops that copied just specific manuscripts provided by the universities with whom they were in convention. So it was actually a very serious system of checking in a time in which there wasn't much of a handmade standardization, and the contents had to be in general said very clearly identical to one another. As we have seen, the 12th century was characterized also by a marked revival of juridical studies that provided theoretical and functional resystematization of the active, the enforced laws in Western Europe. So the law of the Church that had been formed in the course of the centuries as an enormous quantity of conciliar canons and of papal decretals that were sometimes even in contradiction with each other, was collected and rationalized around 1140 by the monk Gratian in the so-called, in fact, Decretum Gratiani, that remained for a long time the fundamental text of the studies of canon law. And at the University of Bologna, instead, it was the Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian to be, studied, to be revived, to be actually reconstructed, as we've seen in medieval law videos, in its own integrity. Right? It was this great work of reconstruction, of philological study, but at the same time, it was naturally connected to this also, intensification in exchange of books with the Byzantine world and so on, but also, dictated by the necessity of integrating the Roman law in the previous legal systems. And it's, however, still in this year, already in these years, that Roman law is, theorized at least as, as, let's say, proposed to become the common law of all Christianity, right? In a frame within which at least disciplining all the various particular laws that existed at the time. So even in here, it's not a substitution. It's actually is to integration properly of the system of the Roman law with the pre-existing laws that were mostly either ethnic or feudal, basically at the time. That, of course, the ecclesiastical law was another important element in here, and in fact, the problems emerged chiefly also from a political point of view. It wasn't much of a juridical problem, strictly speaking. It was about the actual political and social applicability, right? For example, think about Frederick I of Hohenstaufen at the Diet of Roncaglia in 1158 that formulated the theoretical support of the jurists that were studying Roman law at the University of Bologna of the claims of royal power that at that time the Swabian emperor was trying to enforce in the Holy Roman Empire. Also, feudal law was an object of theoretical reflection, right? Feudal law, as you know, was an extremely original and spontaneous form of, more than juridical thinking, but properly of political and social practice, right? And this also was inquired, like, how does it really work? Who really does have prerogatives here? What's the limit of the public authorities that actually work through mostly feudal, systems and the pre-existing laws of the communities, right? This has enormous, consequences in all the history of European law. Think just about the Magna Carta and the debate around the Anglo-Saxon law as such, and the royal one. This eternal debate, but properly it's the struggle of investitures that triggers, chiefly in the great university centers of northern Italy were in the midst of the clash. This enormous theoretical speculation and reflection that naturally counterposed, the rights of the empire, one of the papacy, in at least about certain prerogatives, whereas, the two were still naturally seen as complementary, but nobody quite knew in this world of allegedly universal powers that, never quite achieved any of that universal power on a factual basis, where, the middle ground had to be. And eventually, with the decline of the two authorities, there were also local communities that were basically taking their own space, like saying, there were theorizations by the 15th century in a completely different context that went so far as saying that basically law could be emanated even as from the local communities without asking permission to anyone, right? So that nobody could even think to interfere. It doesn't matter if you were the emperor or the pope. Albeit, the practical reality was more shaded after all. I would spend some word also about the Decretum Gratiani that we have mentioned, actually, because it's one of those works that probably have marked in the entire Western civilization from the time it was emanated onwards. The Camaldolese monk Gratian was probably originary of Chiusi and died after 1179, tied his name, as we've seen, to the decree, to the decretum. So a work that, first of all, was imposing, right? Just about that intellectual effort we were talking about before, of resystematization of the normative material that up to that point had held the juridical life of the church, cumulating canons, but also biblical passages and works of, the fathers of the church and other ecclesiastical orders, letters of popes, penitential books, and even lay texts from the Romano-Germanic tradition. Well, Gratian terminated the work around 1140 using essentially a dialectical method accompanying the collection texts with certain considerations of his. In fact, they were known as the Dicta Gratiani. And the result was a great summa that, for the first time, gave a autonomous, place to the canon law proper, compared to theology. Right? This is a great step for the church, because it defined more, formally and unequivocally what pertained to, the Holy Scriptures and what had to be applicated of them in reality in the possessions of the church. And this was a systematic and compilatory instrument that, albeit not officially recognized by the church itself, right? Because these things were happening autonomously, right? You don't have to think that there was like a full authority here that, controlled everything. The myth of, the persecutions, of the oppression. This was a moment of enormous freedom in the way, the societies were organizing themselves, exactly because there was too much freedom. There was too much lack of power. People needed the point of reference in the first place, especially now that societies were dramatically expanding at every level, right? So this is exactly what makes civilization, right? Not someone who pays someone for doing something, but people that simply come up with their own ideas because these are needed and there is a market that can accept them, right, on their own. This is true freedom. This is true civilization. And this work, in fact, began properly as a textbook for teaching canon law in universities. And it became the base of studying by the side of the jurists of canon law as well. And the extremely interesting aspect of this story is that, of course, lay jurists studied ecclesiastical law like crazy, and vice versa, right? There was a deep compenetration of these two laws and these two systems, because the church in its own right had produced this amazing amount of a very, concrete, rational, logical, homogeneous system, right? And worked with the decreto, right? And whereas, of course, Roman law represented with its own institutions and so on, another enormous piece of normative material from which these scholars were taking also just inspiration from, as we've seen, weren't eager to applicate this, enforcing it all the other legal system pre-existing and enforce and well working most of the times legal systems, and therefore there was this originality in the exchange between the various normatives that produced. Just think, even from a philological point, from a conceptual point of view, what it means to work with all this knowledge and to make it fit all together in a coherent system. This is an effort that today doesn't happen anymore, because there are extremely few people that do not have much of an impact in our societies that occupy themselves with having kind of a thought that can embrace all kind of a regulatory system that has by aim a universal value. People laugh at these concepts today because knowledge is so quantitatively spread that it seems like a hopeless enterprise. Well, these people weren't, after all, in proportion, then they were making a much greater effort, an enormously greater effort than our civilization is doing today in relative terms. These people were really bothering themselves and trying to find a solution that could be valid for reality, right? Always having in mind, the reality of the practice, but also the idea. What did this mean from a broader, conscientious point of view, like from a moral point of view and practical point of view? What was right to impose or not to impose? What was acceptable? What was this all naturally canon law mostly had a branch of it naturally considered properly a natural universal law that was connected deeply to the Bible and to these other great philosophical systems that were deriving, in fact, from that with scholastics and so on. So think about the depth of, the cultural depth of such reflections in a broader sense, right? Who does have the courage of doing that anymore? Today, jurists think fundamentally just about that, or at least their power is limited in their own field. So there are naturally enormous differences at so many levels. It's almost nonsensical to compare the two situations, but the effort, this is what is astonishing for a society like the medieval one. Let's say the lay intellectuals, typically of the Italian cities, were especially the judges and notaries, right? This area of the region of Europe was naturally the most advanced economically speaking, so that's where the secular activities and the need of studying especially juridical subjects had emerged more prepotently, and hence the Bolognese school that will invest from, legally speaking, the whole of Europe, and adapted, let's say, the new political experiences to the tradition of ancient ecclesiastical thought alike. So these people read a lot of other stuff, right? They weren't illiterates. These people were literate since a lot of centuries. These were probably the most literate areas in Europe, the ones that had allowed a greater intellectual specialization. There was an enormous, especially from the jurists, was an enormous, for example, historical, but also theological understanding, right? And to these people are owed, for example, the explicit recalls to Romanity or to the biblical echoes of within the political vocabulary. These guys talk about consulas, the res publica, from one side, then libertas, justitia, paradisus, etc. from the other side. And here we're touching an enormous topic that I hope at some point to discuss in detail. That is exactly what did also all these words mean, because it's not easy to understand at the time. These were all intertwined with the local political economical interests of, even the regulation of violence and of individual prerogatives. What is liberty and republic in the Middle Ages, right? And these were the centers that were pioneering the concepts for their own specific condition. Also think about the city-states, etc. But they were concepts that would go on actually to up to the Renaissance. They were embraced, as eventually become as the European early modern culture. And there is a direct connection between these first reflections and the further modern developments of the continent. And these scholars committed themselves also in the writing of moral treatises, for example, were destined to the education of the citizens, of the rectors, such as the very famous encyclopedia, Les Livres du Trésor, right, the books of the treasure of the notary Brunetto Latini, that was, by the way, also famously one of Dante's masters, teachers. Was chancellor of the commune of Florence during the 13th century. He wrote that this is an enormous work. He traveled extensively in France, in Spain. He collected this enormous amount of books from everywhere that he could find. Right? These were people with truly encyclopedical mind. I think we have forgotten, but it's like they said they had an enormous intellectual sensitivity. They understood things at a depth that rarely we were capable of doing right now. Mostly, standardized, just, mechanic and emptied language that we use conventionally, but of which we don't actually care to understand the deeper implications outside of what it's our practical necessity. Right, these people went far beyond, because there was all a morality mixed down in a fully Christianized society of these implications. What is dramatically fascinating in all of this is that objectively free thinking did not exist as such, right? But not because of the controls, right? This was, as we've seen, still a highly uncontrolled society. It's actually these very communities in here that are trying to create something more structured and systematic, and for the sake of pacification of order, public order. Think about all the economical, the business activities that were connected to this stability. But because they couldn't think in a different way from what, say, for example, the Bible entailed. Right, these people had interiorized now the biblical precepts at a level that maybe the average person in the Middle Ages surely didn't understand anything about the Bible by itself. They just learned that in some certain parts it was connected to a broader, ritual, and so on. But intellectuals were bred into this at a level of, you were inside that. You couldn't even think, like you were not obliged. You couldn't simply think to exceed that, right? And of course, heresies were an enormous problem, but there was properly a conscience about that realized the necessity of a moral standard, of a moral order, in order to make society work. We have talked about these things extensively in the videos about the heresies. We have seen to which principles, which philosophies they were inspired from. There are certain patterns that are somewhat millenary in all this path that still exists today in many ways. But in a world that theoretically had these fixed moral standards, what is astonishing here is how adventurous these people were in finding out and creating. There is properly a creative intelligence that is displayed in here. It is utterly astonishing, right? How these guys from scratch could build these new moral standards, also in not just for moral principles, but how a city could be governed, a state could be governed, right? Latini, for example, was fascinated after he came back from France with the Capetian monarchy. He was a great fan of the French crown. He thought that was a hello system. Here there is a king that rules, and that everybody more or less obey. There is a hierarchy. There is an order. right? Think about confronting it with the Tuscan reality, where every tens of kilometers there was another city, was probably another state that fought on a regular basis with the others. Think about what that meant, right? And still the states were properly big state, because they could field armies were the same size of a royal one. So think about even the parameters. This was a moment of economical booming, right? These are, some of the cradles of intercontinental trade, right? You can't explain the appearance of these individuals, of Dante, if you don't properly realize even the novelty, right? Because 1 generation, 2 generations before, that world was a wholly different one. 2 generations before, there wasn't that level of monetary economy. People still lived, in a very different, just material culture. So there were certain changes were completely new. Like the level of per capita wealth achieved by these communities here was unprecedented in the history of, I think, of easily of humanity, because I don't know any other center that is historically had accumulated per capita. We're talking about per capita all that wealth. Nobody. And that's why the Middle Ages, by the way, are different from, say, the ancient world. Also because things like, wealth distribution changed these aspects. They have, they give another take on reality. And the stake is for the research of an order, proper, right? We could make a beautiful, chronological spectrum of all of these transformations. We try to do it, as a matter of fact. But these moments are crucial for the history of Europe and of the world. And if you look at these individuals, there were many, right? These weren't isolated figures. Think about all the notaries, for example, that were authors of the numerous chronicles of the city events that were the same, were written starting from the 12th century, eventually in vernacular from the 13th, right? So this means, by the way, that that's not that's something that is going to be read by a lot of people in the first place. And think about how that changes politics and what politics already is in these centers. And especially to the notaries is owed the production and preservation of law, of the documents, right, of the rights and of the administrative activities of the communes that was consolidated, especially during the 13th century, by the so-called popular governments, right? So these, in fact, these regimes were held mostly by the middle classes, right? Usually by the merchants, the mercantile class. That, let's not digress on this aspect, but even in there, of course, these were people who literally controlled the greater trade traffics at the time. So they weren't people like others, right? But what they were building from a moral point of view was deeply intertwined with this, we can easily call it, if not capitalistic, but pre-capitalistic thinking. A lot of a basis of our own Western values in many ways, and that for them, however, were not banally sure themselves. They were seriously analyzing the situation and had an enormous collective responsibility, right? Socially speaking, their choices made the destiny of their own communities, and not only those ones, because Europe was starting to gravitate on the financial resources that these guys lent, for example, to sovereigns for making wars and so on, and it changed the history of Europe forever in this regard, exactly in this regard. Some authors have talked about a documentary revolution. Objectively, these centers, especially the Tusco-Angevin area, eventually the Avignonese papacy in the Capetian France, were the center of the true birth of bureaucracy, as we intended in a modern sense, right? This also idea of centralization of archives, of highly skilled bureaucratic personnel, people with a deep understanding, right? Not just mechanical scribes, experts of law that had to control all these important administrative institutional processes from the properly administrative point of view. And that was unavoidably centered on the practical use of writing, and of the writing, of course, of the various registers. And this had a lot of reflections, naturally, also in the arts. Architecture. Think about the passage from the Romanesque style to the one that humanists in the 15th century would have called. It was developed from the mid-12th century, starting from France, right, properly northern France, still what was still properly the Western Frankish kingdom, by formally speaking, and that from here would have spread throughout all the West, right. We have discussed the overwhelming, crushing, undisputable, specific weight of France, right, as a broader political, institutional, culture, even military system in the history of medieval Europe, right. France, we've seen Italy was the richest country per capita in Europe and actually in the world per capita, but France was the richest country in Europe, was framed under this monarchy that actually in this time was in half, like in 2 generations, would have fundamentally achieved its uncontested role, actually surpassing the same Holy Roman Empire in power. But exactly in this period, in mid-12th century, founding the very base of that system would be gloriously triumphing as feudalism on the battlefield of Bouvines, and with scholasticism, with the alliance with the papacy, the broader wealth system stretching from the Channel to Greece, and having an overwhelming impact on all. Think about what Germany, for example, was by the mid-12th century. Right? It was largely still yet to expand in many ways. They didn't have, they hadn't acquired completely. It's just now, for example, they imported properly the feudal system from France, that they started, expanding and from France, this system basically spread all over Europe. Right, French literature was dominating. Even if you look at Germany, in Italy, think about the military. Also, think about the Iberian monarchies and their, in their model, they were inspired in many ways to France. And it's difficult to be concise about this topic, but speaking specifically of the Gothic art that is born here, right, thanks to the very peculiar, properly even terrain resources of the Ile-de-France, right? Even the same stones with which the great Gothic cathedrals were built for as we'll see now, with a specific symbological purpose in their architectural structure, were extracted from this area, that was, by the way, overwhelming rich. It had a very fat earth that allowed also the French kings to develop their own military clientele, their own heavy cavalry. Their fully professional system was gradually homogenized all over Europe from this great center of emanation. Compared to the relatively meager and massive forms were typical of Romanesque, right? I mean, meager from terms of appearance, right? Without particular elaboration. The Romanesque buildings were quite massive, quite crude, if you want. The Gothic was come to be, and there was all a meaning in the Romanesque that doesn't have to be underestimated at all, because Romanesque represented for centuries and throughout all the early Middle Ages an enormously important symbol that helped the civilization of Europe, Christianization, the that had a specific educational meaning, a moral impact on the rural peoples and so on. So it's we will discuss that on another occasion. But the Gothic was gradually characterized by the vertical elan of the buildings, right? For a greater, if you want, elegance and refinement of the traits and the decoration, especially for the wide use of light filtered in the churches from these large colored glasses that are somewhat iconic. And the principle behind that is embodied, chiefly by the first monument erected in this style. It is the famous Abbey of Saint-Denis in the heart of the Ile-de-France, and especially loaded with enormous and mystical and symbolism for the for the French monarchy. The kings of France were vassals of the Abbey of Saint-Denis, right? That's that's place of burial of the French kings. Unfortunately, the French Revolution destroyed everything because, all the sepulchres, etc. But if you visit Paris, because naturally, Saint-Denis was outside. Today, it's incorporated in the city. If you visit there, that was one of the few moments in which I truly felt Stendhal syndrome. That actually, it's also known as Florence Syndrome, and I truly had it at its highest. In fact, in the Florentine Cathedral, because that's something that punches you in the soul, it just smashes you inside in a way you wouldn't imagine. But the Cathedral of Saint-Denis, when you approach the sepulchres of the Capetian king, you start feeling something that is difficult to describe, and you can feel the might of that. You can of that thought, of that spirit that lives on. It doesn't matter what, I know these are kind of very subjective thing, but I couldn't be able to describe it in any way. That is the symbol. That is the symbol that translated the, even just in the architectonical forms, the theories expressed by its own committant, the Abbot Suger, right? The exaltation of light, the spatial imponence of the sacred building that had to communicate to the faithful the greatness of God, the light of the world. This is not your light; it's pure light, right? The whole concept of the Gothic architecture is that the faithful doesn't have to see the walls; it has to see the light, right? That's what dramatically changes from this, darker, more rougher, more Romanesque walls into this highly polished Gothic ones, is that white ones. The light has to reflect on it, and all you have to see is light, right? And that's also what the stained glass is all about. Is pouring this games of colors that have all a perfect. Many people think that it's those in fact like mechanistic thinking that it's thanks to Vitruvius that this medieval people began to rebuild cathedrals. By the way, the time of the Romans, nobody could build in that way with those technologies. The Gothic cathedral is built upon the most important text. You would think it's a engineering text, an architecture text. It's a music text. It's the Musica by St. Augustine. Without that, without the musical numerical proportion, that's all Platonism and Neo-Pythagoreanism in the symbolism. But we know that was how the proportions of all these cathedrals were starting being built. And we know actually what is fascinating, aside from Suger was a great theorist, a great thinker, and he expressed his principles so that we can study them. But we know all these Freemasons and architects and masters and engineers knew the business, knew how to do that already, right? That it means that before even the Gothic cathedrals were built with specific money committed by the king, this was something that doesn't happen. They don't rise up like mushrooms, right? There is a very specific political will for creating this. But what is astonishing is that medieval civilization had already achieved a more advanced technological level than the ancient world. So that a fully innovative concept here was realized, right, perfectly by masters that already knew how to build that thing, even if nobody had ever built that, and they managed to do that. And there is this age, high medieval or low medieval times, with 80 cathedrals all over Europe. Right, at a certain point, these were something so great that at a certain point they didn't even have the time to complete it, because it went on for generations. By the crisis of the 14th century, many were stopped, so that we completed them in Europe by the 19th century. In many cases, aside ones that sadly were destroyed during the Second World War, but and also in previous conflicts, of course. But it's an unicum in civilization in general, because worldwide you don't find anything like that. No other world produced that. Right? And think just what it meant for this endless open spaces. Think about France specifically. This enormous green, can't say valleys, not even flatlands proper. This is mostly a hilly ground, but that you're right, from tens of kilometers, you could see these giants that touch the sky, right? In all these passages in the 12th century Renaissance, the idea that mankind can dominate the universe, that God has entrusted to them, right? Mankind has a duty, according to Christianity, to discover the world, scientifically speaking. And this is what these people were doing. Think about the devastating feelings that a person could feel in this regard, in having accomplished that for the first time. Right, we think it was a big deal, the first flight over the Atlantic, or the first great skyscrapers, the modern cities, right? But think about this. Like, this was much deeper in so many ways that it's difficult to explain properly. And how much do we remember of this every day? These are things that every Westerner, at least, but every person in the world, because this is world heritage in many ways, should think of, right? Of course, other peoples had other accomplishments. There is astonishing things that mankind has been able to achieve, but how much, for the benefit of the world's education, awareness, and empowerment, do we think of what we were able to do back then, by the 12th century, with these masterpieces? This is something unique. If you can mention easily the later Cathedral of Chartres, erected between 1194 and 1260, that imposed this this further model of the facade with 3 portals, flanked by 2 bell towers that were ever richer in the walls and crenellation, right? But in general, in all the other great cathedrals, you can find but what is fascinating about Gothic architecture is that, in spite of this common universalistic symbol, there was every country kind of developed its own Gothic, right? This thing actually, I should say, many intuitions of Gothic architecture were actually provided by England proper. Right, and that's also where you find, in fact, mostly northern France and England, where you find the most advanced Gothic proper, right? German Gothic is different. It's equally beautiful in many ways. Italy develops its own peculiar type of Gothic that is, still presenting of Romanesque and even Byzantine influences. Spain develops its own Gothic as well, but properly, what began in the 12th century, it's mostly embodied, not surprisingly, by these 2 major national monarchies of England and France that were developing, in fact, this ideology, this art, these models in parallel with their own monarchies, right? So all these cathedrals are connected by something, but they're also different according to their local influences and contexts and so on. So anyhow, we'll stop it here because otherwise it gets way too dispersive, more than it actually is. But I think it's important to reflect on these topics at all times. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.